My name is Sterling Bryan. I'm the president of the British Columbia Academic Health Science Network. And I'd like to welcome you to the session today, which is on pragmatic clinical trials and learning health systems. And this, of course, is a session that is part of the Clinical Trials BC conference entitled The Modernization of Clinical Trials. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you from North Vancouver, and I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Coast Salish peoples whose traditional and unceded territory is where I reside. I express gratitude to the Squamish Nation and to the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, and I truly value the opportunity to live, work, and play on these traditional lands. So just to start with a bit of an introduction to BC Academic Health Science Network. So Clinical Trials BC is a component part of the BC AHSN, along with Research Ethics BC, and also the BC Support Unit, which is the unit that focuses on patient-oriented research. And a key goal that we have at the BC Academic Health Science Network is to support the development of learning health systems in British Columbia. And so today is an important and also an exciting day for us as we discuss the role of pragmatic clinical trials in the context of learning health systems. So I'd like to acknowledge that much of our work at BC AHSN on methods has been funded from two funding agencies, both the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, as well as the Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research. And I am thankful to both of those organizations for their ongoing support of methods research undertaken at BC AHSN. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers for the session. We have two speakers in this session. First, we'll hear from Dr. Lindsay Hedden. Lindsay is an assistant professor in learning health systems in the Faculty for Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University. She's also the assistant scientific director with us here at the BC Academic Health Science Network. And so Lindsay will provide us with an overview of learning health systems, and her talk will be will provide grounding for discussions that we'll have throughout the day. Following Lindsay will be a talk from Dr. Merrick Zworenstein. Merrick is a health services researcher, and his focus is on research methodology, specifically the use of randomized clinical trials in the context of evaluating complex interventions in primary care. So his talk will provide us with a primer on pragmatic clinical trials. And following the two talks, we will have a moderated discussion on the role and some of the challenges associated with using pragmatic clinical trials in the context of learning health systems. We will then have a part two to the morning, which will be an opportunity for us to hear about examples of pragmatic clinical trials, both conducted locally as well as internationally. And so we will now progress, and I'll hand over to Lindsay Hedden to provide the first talk for this morning.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. I'm going to provide you with a little bit of a primer on learning health systems. So what they are, why they're needed, and how we can build one here. I'm going to start by providing a bit of background on the learning health systems framework. I'll move a bit to why the model has been really slow to have traction here in BC and in the Canadian context more broadly. And I'm going to close by giving just a little bit of information about what AHSN is doing to support the ongoing work in this area. So why do we need a learning health system? The concept of a learning health system came out of work that was done by the Institute of Medicine in the United States back in 2005. And it was born from this idea that even though our levels of knowledge and innovation are skyrocketing, very often that knowledge isn't making its way through to improve patient care. And as such, quality, costs, equity, and outcomes are not improved. And that generates waste and harm within the system. Early work in this area actually suggests that it's about 17 years between a new validated piece of clinical knowledge and actual change in clinical practice. And I think that this window is actually even longer when the outcome is a change in policy. So what is a learning health system then? Well, the Institute of Medicine has defined a learning health system as one in which science, informatics, incentives, and culture are aligned for continuous improvement and innovation, with best practices that are seamlessly embedded into the delivery process and new knowledge captured as an integral byproduct of the care experience itself. There are some challenges to using this definition in the Canadian context, however. So first, the focus is largely on health care rather than on the health system, the latter of which would include sectors such as social services, housing, education, which are increasingly engaged in efforts to improve health outcomes. Second, it's silent on element of the quadruple aim outside of the patient experience. So population health, provider experiences, and keeping costs manageable, for example. Third, the focus is at the level of individual clinical encounters. So it's missing patient self-management and levels above the individual clinical encounter that would be relevant to the Canadian context. So the clinic level, health authority level, provincial level, etc. Lastly, it uses some labels that we don't tend to use here. For example, informatics instead of data. The McMaster Health Forum has proposed a different definition that is more applicable to the Canadian context. So they refer to a learning health system as the combination of a health system and a research system that at all levels is anchored on patient need, perspective, and aspiration, is driven by timely data and evidence, is supported by appropriate decision supports and aligned governance, financial and delivery arrangements, and is enabled within a culture of rapid learning and improvement. At the level of the individual clinical encounter, within a learning health system, you have what Charles Friedman has referred to as virtuous cycles of learning. On one side of the cycle, you have data to knowledge, where quantitative and qualitative data are used to understand where the system is really working well and where it's not working well. An important part of this is that the data are collected routinely, accurately, and at the right level of granularity, and that they're made available for research. On the knowledge to practice side, the knowledge that's obtained through the data to knowledge arm is fed back into practice through tailored messaging and tailored actions. Finally, in practice to data, changes are monitored and evaluated so that the pursuit of quality improvement is ongoing and cyclic in nature. Though through these cycles, best practice knowledge is immediately available to support decisions, and improvement is continuous through ongoing study. But while these loops enable learning, they do not themselves create a system. So how then do we deal with a context where we have multiple learning loops, each one addressing a different problem, or even the same problem in a different context? We have no scale up and no spread of best practices. So Friedman refers to this idea of a single supporting platform that anchors multiple simultaneous cycles of learning. It must include big data, but it's more than just that. It also has to have mechanisms to tailor messaging to decision makers for capturing change practice. So in this case, the large cycles at the top of the diagram are policy solutions to big, difficult system-wide issues, while the smaller ones that are close to the platform are smaller issues, perhaps at the level of the patient encounter or within a single clinic or organization. Much of the Canadian and indeed international learning health system research has focused on these individual learning cycles that are close to the platform and ones that are occurring typically within a very defined and closed clinical context. There's been much less work done in terms of how we move these cycles to a true learning health system with this supportive platform in place. This framework, developed by Munir and colleagues, is meant to illustrate how structures, processes, and outcomes of those learning health system cycles tie together with the aim of optimizing health system performance, delivering greater value in health systems. The framework describes 4 elements that characterize a learning health system, namely core values, pillars and accelerators, processes, and outcomes. Munir and colleagues identify several core values that underpin a functioning learning health system. An emphasis on participatory leadership, inclusiveness, scientific rigor, patient-centeredness, equity, and solidarity. Under learning health system pillars, he refers to the infrastructure, systems, and resources that provide the foundational supports for learning health systems. Whereas accelerators represent specific supports that accelerate the learning within these systems. The 6 main pillars they identify are scientific, technological, policy, legal, and ethical pillars. These pillars support the execution, routinization, and acceleration of learning cycles, which are the fundamental processes of learning health systems. You'll notice that in the section under learning health system process, he uses that same cyclic diagram that was developed by Friedman and colleagues: practice to data, data to knowledge, and knowledge to practice. The execution of these cycles is driven by communities of interest, which comprise a core group of actors who are motivated to tackle a collective problem and use and align the learning health system pillars to achieve their goals. It's important to note that different scientific approaches can and should support each of the 3 parts of this learning cycle. Quality improvement initiatives and approaches, for example, support the knowledge to practice side. Pragmatic clinical trials, which we're going to hear more about in the next presentation, can be powerful tools to support the data to knowledge step in particular. So in the best of circumstances, the learning health system model is a challenging one to implement because it requires a fundamental change in the way that we collect, store, share, and use data within the system. It also creates changes to the practice of medicine itself, in that appointments have to include time and process to collect patient experience data, not just standard electronic medical record entry. There are some unique challenges also to enabling the learning health system model and building that supportive platform and infrastructure within the Canadian context. Some clinical contexts will also be inherently more challenging than others, and I'll use primary care as one example of one of those sort of trickier ones. The conceptualization and application of learning health systems, particularly in the US literature, has been focused within these tight, closed clinical contexts, where patients have a more or less complete record within a single data system, or systems that are meant to link and communicate well with each other. And a great example of this would be a high-performing health maintenance organization. In Canada, in contrast, care is fractured across multiple points of service, each with their own data systems that don't necessarily play nicely together. Patient data are therefore fragmented, making getting a complete clinical picture for each patient a tricky challenge. There are several other data infrastructure challenges that we have to address as well. So while we have actually made substantial investments in developing our data infrastructure over the last decade, the infrastructure remains plagued by problems of interoperability and the inability to link and aggregate data where it's needed. So this is particularly problematic in the context of primary care, where we have a multitude of electronic medical record systems with different underlying data processes and policies. And individual clinics and institutions have their own mandates and legal frameworks that make moving data to a central location for research purposes challenging or impossible in some cases. There are also a few mechanisms that have been introduced to ensure strong and necessary patient involvement in health system design and priority setting. Also, patient-reported outcomes and patient experience measures, which are critical to building a learning health system, are not routinely collected in most contexts. And when they are, they're frequently not linked within EMR systems in a way that patient-level data analysis can be conducted. There are also legal and privacy challenges. So efforts to build provincial or national clinical registries or electronic medical record-based research networks or data systems have often been slowed or stalled due to a multitude of provincial laws that govern personal health information. There are also some big challenges with respect to culture and governance. So provincial health systems have really struggled to establish a necessary culture of learning and improvement. Furthermore, parts of the system suffer from an absence of meso-level governance structures, which are critical for supporting scale and spread. So coming back to, again, primary care being a good example here. Physicians are acting as independent small business owners, and that really limits higher level policy action. We can't readily, for example, enforce the use of a specific EMR or the sharing of data that would be possible in a hospital setting. So we're forced to sort of rely on these indirect, like carrot and stick policy measures to encourage physicians to practice a certain way or to use certain tools. Lastly, there are some specific challenges with respect to research. So our national and often provincial level health research funding is not yet aligned to support rapid innovation cycles. And there's really only scant funding that's been directed towards change management and spread and scale of innovation. Units within health authorities, individual clinics, et cetera, don't often have budget wiggle room to develop and implement and evaluate infrastructure and to fund these ongoing cycles of learning. So I'm going to move now just to talk a little bit about the ongoing work that AHSN is doing in this area that will hopefully start to address some of these tricky challenges in the Canadian context. So first, we are beginning this year to conduct a learning health system environmental scan and priority setting exercise. So our objective here is to be able to identify all emerging and existing learning health systems in the province and describe how these systems have operationalized and instituted the characteristics of the learning health system model. So where are they? What clinical areas do they work in? What are the common strengths and challenges that they are experiencing within this system when it comes to how they've implemented the learning health system model? In the second phase of this work, we're going to leverage the results from the scan to be able to identify and prioritize the most salient learning health system knowledge gaps for BC from the patient, research, and health system perspectives. And we're going to be using a patient-oriented mixed methods consensus development approach for these projects. The second place where we're working is this development of a technical working group. So the technical working group for learning health system development is going to act as a facilitator for discussion and exchange by and for organizations, institutions, and communities of practice who are working to develop, implement, and evaluate learning health systems within their own communities. This technical working group will also guide AHSN's current and future projects in the learning health system area. And members of our group are going to include invited leaders from learning health systems within the province, as well as patient representatives, data and research leadership, health authority, and Ministry of Health representatives. Third, AHSN has an active role in supporting clinical networks, which we see as critical to the scale and spread of learning health systems. So we currently have active partnerships with the BC Emergency Medicine Network and the Rural Coordinating Centre of BC, and we're working to develop a broader policy in terms of how we engage with these clinical networks in support of learning health system development. Lastly, AHSN is an ongoing supporter of the BC Health Data Platform, which we see as core infrastructure for learning health system development. The platform establishes a federated health data sharing ecosystem where data that are held by multiple organizations can be assembled for a single point of access and linked for research and analysis purposes for multiple types of users. It's meant to encourage rapid ongoing access to data to support, again, those rapid cycles of learning, specifically for real world and pragmatic trials and quality improvement work. So thanks very much for your time and attention today. I hope I've provided you with a solid understanding of the basics of a learning health system model, its potential for implementation in Canada, some of the challenges that we're facing, and AHSN's early program of work in this area. I would be happy to take any questions at this time.
Hi. I'm Eric Sorenstein, and I'm going to be presenting a short primer on pragmatic trials. I'm a researcher in health services in the Department of Family Medicine at Western University. I'm going to minimize the video if you don't mind. The learning objectives for today are to recognize that there are two different types of randomized trials with different purposes or intentions. The pragmatic approach to randomized trials has the purpose of providing evidence for decision makers so that they can select between alternative interventions. The explanatory purpose for a randomized trial is much more like a scientific or laboratory experiment in which we're testing a hypothesis about a presumed mechanism of action confirming whether or not it in fact exists. The second thing we're going to try and do is to understand the relationship between internal and external validity. And then we'll move on to the PRECI2 tool, the Pragmatic Explanatory Continuum Indicator Summary tool, a bit of a mouthful, which is a tool designed to help you design your trial so that it matches the purpose that you intend, either pragmatic or explanatory. So the strength of the randomized controlled trial, and the reason why we have over 500,000 of these in the world literature, is its internal validity. And it's unique in comparison with other study designs in that the randomization itself tends to guarantee that the measurement of the effect size among the trial participants and in the trial setting and at the time of the trial is a valid measure of the effect size without bias. Now, this is not related to external validity. Internal validity does not necessarily create external validity. In other words, the internal validity of a trial which is unbiased, is not necessarily going to give you a valid prediction of the effect size among other participants elsewhere or at other times. And it's randomization which gives us the equalization of the distribution of confounders and non-specific causes between the arms of a trial, leaving only either the treatment effect or chance as a cause of any difference in effect size between those arms. Chance we deal with by the size of the study, and so assuming the study is large enough, we end up with a study design which tends to give us a valid, an internally valid estimate of the treatment effect size. Second advantage of the randomized controlled trial design is that it has face validity, a simple analysis, and an intuitive understanding which is built upon thousands of years of using chance, drawing straws, betting, gambling in our cultures. Now, the traditional randomized controlled trial design choices tend to undermine the external validity of the trial, sometimes with the belief that this is necessary in order to maintain or maximize internal validity. And as a result, at least these four choices are often made in traditionally designed randomized trials. Quite unusual patients, providers, and sites are chosen. The delivery of care is different from what it would usually be in normal delivery of care if that intervention was in use in usual care. Often the outcomes chosen are obscure and difficult to interpret for those who are directly concerned with treatment or receiving treatment for the condition. And finally, the comparators that are chosen are also often confusing. We'll start with the peculiar choices of patients, providers, and site. So often in traditional randomized trials, we default to selecting patients who are more severe, but not maximally so. We want them to have a high chance of having an outcome event, but not such a high degree of severity that there's no room for improvement. But we also want no competing causes of mortality or morbidity, and so patients are selected with no comorbidities or very few, and also in a narrow age range, and sometimes even we exclude people who are not good adherers to their treatment. For trial sites or clinicians, we tend to select those with more experience of randomized trials and those with more experience of the intervention which we're aiming to evaluate. And as a result, our trials tend to produce better outcomes than usual care. About the participants in about 70% of randomized trials are different in important ways from the patients in the setting in which that treatment would be used once approved for usual care. So in an overview that Tessa Kennedy Martin published, she found that age, morbidity, and other factors such as severity were markedly different from what one would find in usual care for that treatment once it was approved. Moving on to the distorted delivery of care, we often find that in randomized trials there are extra interventions and investigations compared to usual care. Perhaps they're quite strict protocols for treatment, which is monitored, the reminders to clinicians, sometimes even selection of clinicians for skill and for ability to adhere to these protocols. The same is true for patients who are often selected for adherence. And in addition, we have a massive data collection, which may be both intensive and intrusive on the usual processes of care. The outcomes chosen are often short-term, and they're not as patient relevant as they might be, which makes the meaning of the trial in terms of its outcomes indirectly useful, but not easy to interpret directly for patients and often for clinicians. And finally, the comparators chosen are not those which would make sense in usual care. Often the comparator is a low dose of an old drug or a placebo, neither of which would be acceptable in current usual care practice. So we're left with a situation in which our traditional approach to randomized trials sacrifices external validity in the belief that this promotes internal validity. But it's worth asking whether indeed it is a zero-sum game, or whether in fact they're independent and that an increase in external validity has no necessary impact on internal validity. Now, since external validity is not a statistical process, so one doesn't estimate external validity statistically, but is a judgment call. And since internal validity relates very largely to randomization and maintaining appropriate division of the intervention and control groups, it's pretty clear that they are independent. And this is a foundation of the work that was done in the 1960s by Daniel Schwartz and Joseph Lelouch, two French statisticians, on the difference between explanatory and pragmatic trials. Their paper was titled Explanatory and Pragmatic Attitudes in Therapeutic Trials, because they focused not on the structure and design of the trial initially, but on the intention behind the trial, and they felt that this intention is crucial. The quote there in the gray box, in this paper we basically argue that most trials are not adequately formulated, not well designed. Their inadequacy is fundamental, in that trials may be aimed at the solution of one or other of two radically different kinds of problem. And this is the difference between decision-making and a new generalizable but experimental knowledge of mechanisms of action. So the explanatory approach at the bottom there, a trial with an explanatory attitude has the intention of testing a hypothesis that a specific causal mechanism is activated by a treatment. So the focus is all about maximizing the effect of that treatment on that causal mechanism. The pragmatic attitude, by contrast, is to help decision makers choose between interventions in ways that are as close as possible to the decision that those decision makers would have to make in real world care. These different purposes or intentions require quite different design choices. And these design choices have been clarified in the PRECI and now the updated PRECI 2 tool, which was designed by my PhD student, Kirsty Ludon, and the team surrounding her at the University of Aberdeen in 2015. This article, the article describing the PRECI 2 tool is referenced there at the bottom left and was published in the British Medical Journal. Essentially, there are 4 stages in using the PRECI 2 tool to help you design your trial. The first is to decide on your intention, the intention of your trial. What do you want to use the information arising from that trial, its findings for? The second is to align the design features, 9 of them are shown around the periphery, the perimeter of the circle here, to align these design features to match that intention. Then one plots the design features on the wheel with each design domain, as we call them, between 1 and 5, with more pragmatic at the 5 level on the outside and more explanatory at the 1 on the inside. It's a semi-qualitative scale, and we don't have precise measurements on where to put these things. And so we recommend that the use of this tool during the design phase is done in groups, the group of trial designers, so that the discussion can be informative and can help individuals in the group discuss how the trial should be designed. At what point on that scale for each of those 9 domains should this trial be set? So let's go over the 9 domains themselves. The first is eligibility. That's at 12 o'clock on that the Précis circle that I showed you, the Précis wheel. And it's asking questions around eligibility. To what extent are the participants in the trial like those who would receive this intervention if it was part of usual care? So for a very explanatory approach with lots of exclusions, such as non-compliant patients, non-responders, patients at low risk for the primary outcome, but who would otherwise, had this intervention being used in care, be receiving it, children, the elderly, or else the definition of patients using diagnostic tests not used in usual care. These would be much more explanatory approaches to inclusion with lots of exclusions. The opposite end of that domain, of that scale, would score 5. And in this case, the goal of the trial and the criteria it was using for inclusion and exclusion would essentially be identical to those used in usual care once the usual care incorporated this intervention, should it be effective. So the main inclusion criteria would be to have the condition at a level of severity where the treatment has been shown to be effective. And that is more or less how one would establish the trial. With recruitment, the second domain, one is asking whether extra effort is made to recruit participants, or if recruitment is done in different ways to those that would be used in the usual care setting to engage with patients. So for example, screening patients at a tertiary hospital for a condition that would usually be treated in a community hospital would probably be a different recruitment process and may lead to a different kind of patient and thus a different degree of external validity, applicability for the trial that you do with a more explanatory approach to recruitment. The setting, third domain, how different are the settings of the trial from the anticipated usual care setting? And that would again be the difference, for example, between a tertiary hospital with specialties in the area in which the trial is being conducted versus a community hospital. But here the issue would not be how the patients differ, but how the setting itself differs and what it can provide and what it can't. The fourth is organization. How different are the resources, the provider expertise, and the organization of care delivery from those in the usual care situation? Are extra resources added for the conduct of the trial? 5, 6, and 7 relate to flexibility in delivery. Flexibility in delivery being with reference to the clinicians providing the care, whether they are providing protocolized care for the purposes of the trial, or whether it's within professional discretion on what co-interventions, for example, should be provided, as it would normally be in usual care. Flexibility and adherence. This would ask whether trial monitoring or adherence improvement is being applied at a level of intensity different from that you would find in usual care. And then the data collection domain would be looking at whether measurement and follow-up of participants is more intrusive than would be the clinical monitoring of patients in usual care. The last two domains in the 9-item Précis tool are about the primary outcome asking to what extent the trial's primary outcome is directly relevant to participants. And those participants could be patients, clinicians, or decision makers. And then finally, the primary analysis, which is asking to what extent are all data included in the analysis of the primary outcome. So at least an intention to treat analysis, but with a high degree of follow-up as well, and very little loss to follow-up. So those are the domains that we would discuss in the PRECI tool, the PRECI2 tool, during the process of design of an intervention. One other is likely to be added during the next update of the PRECI tool, PRECI3, which is underway at present. And that extra domain is the nature of the comparison group, with a placebo comparator and blinding being on the more explanatory end, and well-described usual care, or perhaps an active comparator, if that's appropriate for the trial, on the more pragmatic end. So that's the PRECI2 Schwartz and Lelouch Sackett definition and use of the term pragmatic and the domains which contribute to it. But others use the term pragmatic in slightly different ways. For example, a number of funders like NIH and PCORI in the US, or the National Institutes for Health Research in the UK, do indeed refer to PRECI2, but they also focus on the number of practical characteristics of trials and incorporate those into their definition of pragmatic. So for example, PCORI is very excited and enthusiastic about trials which use large administrative or electronic medical record data sets to substitute for primary data collection. Where there is a usual care comparator, they like it to be extremely well characterized. NIH, for example, still prefers a protocolized comparator. Active comparators are okay for both of those funders for comparative effectiveness research questions, testing already well-tested interventions against each other, head-to-head. And then lastly, PCORI in particular emphasizes patient engagement in design of the trials. So that's the funders. Researchers often use the term pragmatic rhetorically. In other words, not really using any particular definition of it other than that it tries to be or proposes that it has been more inclusive of patients. Of course, researchers mostly do use intention to treat analyses now. That's a long-standing trend since the 80s. And so often domain 9, the analysis domain, is pretty pragmatic in most trials. In summary then, it's important to choose the intention of your trial explicitly and to match your design choices to that intention, be it pragmatic or be it explanatory. While the intentions of the two kinds of trials are a dichotomy, the actual trial designs themselves are not. Pragmatic trials are at one end of a multi-actual continuum and explanatory trials at the other. The 9 factors which make up that multi-actual continuum are the 9 factors of the PRECI2 tool. And these 9 factors are also the basis for external validity of the trial. In other words, applicability beyond the trial itself. On the other hand, internal validity is dependent entirely on randomization and maintaining that random allocation to the end of the trial. As a result, internal and external validity are independent, and there's no trade-off in which more external validity results in less internal validity. These pragmatic characteristics also make the trial more suitable for incorporation into a usual care setting, more useful for patients and clinicians, and much more feasible for learning health systems. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Lindsay and Merrick, for your contributions. I think you provided an excellent overview of learning health systems and pragmatic clinical trials that gives us a lot of opportunity for discussion. And what I want to try and focus on in the discussion, if you like, is I see a Venn diagram So like there's the pragmatic clinical trials, Venn, a piece of the Venn diagram, and then there's the learning health systems piece. And I think it's the overlap that we want to try and focus on. We could have a lot of discussion about pragmatic trials. We could have a lot of discussion about learning health systems. I think in this session, we want to try and ensure that we're thinking about pragmatic clinical trials in the context of learning health systems. So I'm going to take Chair's privilege and kick the discussion off. I recognize Cindy Triton wins the prize for the very first question submitted. So you will get a prize for that, Cindy. So thank you for that. And I will come to that question. But I'm just going to start off by asking Lindsay to start with, just to reflect on the role of pragmatic clinical trials in learning health systems. So just sort of like speak to that overlap in the Venn diagram from your perspective, and then I'll ask Merrick to do the same before we go to Cindy. Thanks.
Sure. So I think, as I alluded to a little bit in my presentation, I think the primary place that pragmatic trials tend to fit in the context of the learning health system is on that data to knowledge piece. And I think they are a particularly nimble tool when we're talking about addressing those questions. If we think about the diagram that Chuck Friedman has with the infrastructure at the bottom and the increasing size of cycles at the top, I think pragmatic trials are great at addressing questions that happen maybe a little bit closer to that data infrastructure, but also are great tools for sort of scale and spread as we are starting to move up and generate new policy on that side. So maybe I'll let Merrick jump in and expand on that a bit.
Thanks, Lindsay. I think that we're talking about a randomized trial. And so really we're talking only about one small part of the kinds of research that is done in learning health systems. But focusing on that, on the randomized trial, I think that we can think of two kinds of randomized trials. Let's talk about them as clinical trials, which match our idea of drug trials or technology trials or vaccine trials on the one hand. And then let's think about them as health services, intervention, knowledge translation, public health education, a wide range of other interventions that health systems provide as the second group. I think in regard to the first group, the classic clinical trial of a new intervention or a new technology, I think that there is a real advantage in conducting many of these trials within learning health systems. And the prime advantage is that if these trials are conducted in learning health systems, then they are almost by definition conducted under conditions of usual clinical care with a wide range of providers, a wide range of settings, and a wide range of patients. Appropriate, but wide. So we would tend to steer away from the undue narrowness which we've tended to suffer from in previous clinical trial history, where the group selected to participate in the trial, both the patients and the clinicians, is so narrow that the challenge becomes one of applicability. Is this finding applicable in usual care? Well, if those trials are conducted in usual care, in the form of learning health systems, with strong engagement by typical frontline practitioners, important decision makers in those very systems, patients playing an active role, if those actors, those stakeholders are playing a part in the definition and design of the clinical trial, then I think there's no doubt that those trials will be much more relevant to the needs of those stakeholders. Much more relevant, and because they're already conducted within a learning care system, a usual care system, much more easy to implement both within that system and expansions across the entire system in which that learning is taking place. So I think there are real advantages in embedding our pragmatic clinical trials within learning health systems, and for learning health systems to think about which questions they're asking require that rigor, that internal validity that is offered by randomization. So I think there's a really fruitful overlap there on the clinical side. And similarly, there's a really fruitful overlap on the health services side, not least because many of these health services trials are most appropriately done by randomizing clusters, not individual patients. And so who else has clusters if not a health system?
and the learning health system would understand those clusters really well, have them already documented and reflected within their databases, and so make possible the randomization of clusters to a new approach to delivering some aspect of care or other. The other huge advantage of conducting these kind of health services cluster randomized pragmatic trials within a learning health system is that health systems routinely roll out new interventions and new ways of delivering care, not to everybody at once, but in a staged process. And since the health system itself is already used to staging that process, why not also encourage the health system to think about when you can randomize rather than arbitrarily allocate the rollout of such an intervention. And there's study designs now which are coming to the fore, stepped wedge cluster randomized trials, which are perfectly suited for that kind of within learning health system, gradual rollout on a randomized basis of an intervention. So I think there's an enormous amount of critical overlap where it's really amazingly win-win, and each of these elements offers huge advantages to the other. The learning health system to the trial design, the pragmatic trial design to the learning health system.
Thanks very much, Merrick, and thanks very much, Lindsay. So I'm going to go to Cindy. So Cindy's first question was to you, Lindsay, and it's asking you about the environmental scan work that is being undertaken and being led by you as part of the BC Academic Health Science Network. So the question is about how that work is going to be structured, and how the terminology is going to, what definitions are going to be used, etc. So maybe you could take that one and just give us a brief indication about how this environmental scan work is going to go forward.
Sure. Thanks for your important question, Cindy. So first of all, you make a really critical point around the understanding of definitions and terminology that might be used in an academic context that wouldn't necessarily be familiar to the people who are really working on the ground in a learning health system model. They may not even know that they're working in a learning health system model, and that it's something that we're deeply aware of. So there are a couple of things that I will add in response to that. First is we're not going out in search of systems that are identified as being the learning health system model. So we're going to identify people who are doing work that addresses some of the pillars that came up in Matt Manier's article, some of the processes that Chuck Friedman has identified through his work and that have also been advanced by Matt Manier and his team. So it's about identifying those individual components rather than the system as a whole. The second thing is that the scan is going to be guided by a technical working group, and on our technical working group, we have identified experts and representatives who are already working towards a learning health system model within their contexts, and those representatives are going to be really helpful in terms of supporting us to identify places where learning health system type innovation are happening, to make sure that we're capturing everyone. So we recognize that there are going to be lots of places in the system where there may be elements of a learning health system model that are in place and that are working well, but you couldn't necessarily classify that particular system as a fully fledged learning health system. And we really want to make sure that we're capturing those folks, in particular because those places where they're sort of working towards learning health systems still can teach us a lot in terms of where are the stopgaps, like what's preventing you from taking it to the next step, adding the next element of the learning health system. What are the things that have been easier to implement, and how can we share those learnings across? In terms of the structure of the scan, there's going to be sort of two pieces. The first is going to be a higher level descriptive survey in which we want to be able to actually identify where are all the places where those elements of the learning health system across the province are being built and supported, and what do they look like? So what patient populations are they covering? What is the clinical context? What is the geographic context? So again, that sort of high level part. The second piece is among the people that are going to participate in the survey, we're going to identify a core group that we're going to invite to participate in some qualitative interviews. And it's in the context of those qualitative interviews where we're really going to be able to explore what are those strengths, what are those challenges. And it's in the context, I think, of those interviews where the language will be particularly important. So we can get a sense of how are people who are implementing some of these approaches describing them themselves, rather than us just applying the sort of academic terminology. So hopefully that addresses your question, and I'm happy to chat by email if you have others as well.
Great, thanks very much, Lindsay. So yes, if people have specific questions around the environmental scan work, then please feel free to reach out to Lindsay and others at BCHSN. Merrick, we've got a question which asks about examples of where the PRACY2 tool has been used in partnership with patients, clinicians, healthcare administrators in the design of pragmatic clinical trials. So can you just briefly give us some sense of where there might be examples?
So there are about 500 papers that have cited the PRACY2 tool since its publication in 2015. But many of those have used it rhetorically, in other words, brandishing the reference to our paper as a way of saying, yeah, we really did a pragmatic trial. But a surprisingly small proportion of those have actually used it in a substantive way. I think among the most substantive uses of it have been in a program within the NIH, the National Institutes of Health in the US, where the National Institutes of Health Collaboratory on clinical trial innovation has really made use of the PRACY2, the original PRACY, and now the PRACY2 tool, to encourage the people whom it's funded to use that tool to iterate and improve on and match their trials to the purpose that they aimed it at. So we've certainly seen some funders pick up on this tool. PCORI cites it, NIHR in the UK cites it as references for anyone who applies for grants. But it's rather thinner on the ground when we start looking for learning health systems thinking about pragmatic trials. And although there are individuals and individual pragmatic trials within large health systems, I think that's still, and I defer to Lindsay on this, I think that's still some steps away from being a learning health system. So I can't cite an instance in which a large health system has picked up on PRACY2 and used it as a template for encouraging researchers and clinicians and others in their system to design randomized trials. I hope there will be some, and given the way that BC is moving, I wouldn't be surprised if the first learning health systems to make PRACY2 a template for design might well be in BC.
Thanks very much. Well, there's a challenge to us, so maybe we should be responding positively to that challenge. Thanks, Merrick. There's a comment from Fidel Villa Rodriguez about the funding of pragmatic clinical trials, and the comment is that SPORE, CIHR, and the Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research did have, under its banner, the ICT funding mechanism, the Innovative Clinical Trials mechanism, but that is no longer active. So where might we seek funding for the conduct of pragmatic trials? I guess sort of like there's also a question, do we mean the same thing by innovative clinical trials as we mean by pragmatic clinical trials? Merrick, maybe you could just briefly comment on that piece as well.
Well, the now paused Innovative Clinical Trials funding framework referred to a number of different innovations in trial design. Not all of them were to do with randomized trials, if I remember correctly, but amongst the other innovations that they referred to were cluster randomized trials, as well as pragmatic randomized trials. So I think it was a push forward on a broad front of randomized trial innovation. It wasn't exclusively or predominantly focused on making the trials more applicable or making them more usual care trials conducted in learning health systems. How should we proceed? Well, I think the one way to proceed is to make the pragmatic trial approach, that attitude to trial design, normative. In other words, make it part of the usual discussions. And that means that people who want to do trials of this kind should be joining, for Canadians, CIHR trial committees, trial panels, and making comments within the discussions in those trial panels on the degree to which a given randomized trial is providing direct, immediately usable information for people who have to make decisions versus being much more laboratory style experimental hypothesis testing work. So I think the place where these trials should be funded is in the normal channels by which randomized trials are funded. And I think it's going to happen when there's more demand from within those channels for such trials that are immediately usable.
Great, thanks very much. So Joel Singer actually puts forward a very interesting sort of perspective, I guess, from a biostatistician and trialist point of view. His point is that maybe you would expect explanatory trials to actually precede pragmatic trials, and that might then be associated with some resistance to proceed with a pragmatic trial once you've already engaged in an explanatory trial. And he also makes the point that potentially you might need larger sample sizes for pragmatic trials because the differences that you might expect are smaller. So again, Merrick, do you want to just comment on that perspective?
Well, the second one is interesting because that's a hypothesis, but it's not actually been empirically shown that the effect sizes in pragmatic trials matched for intervention is smaller than that in more explanatory trial designs. In fact, the only piece of work I've done on it, which is very, very early and exploratory, suggests that the effect sizes are about the same. And there's a much larger study out of Alberta looking at cardiovascular trials, which also fails to find the connection between effect size of trials and the degree to which they're pragmatic. So I think we'd have to take that second caution as a hypothesis at the moment, something that needs a good deal more empirical evidence. Could you just restate that first question, which I'm afraid I've...
So the first part of the question was to do with the ordering. Joel suggests that you would actually want to be doing an explanatory trial in advance of then moving to a pragmatic trial. Is that right?
I don't think it's necessarily right, especially if it turns out that the effect sizes are not that different. Mm-hmm. If the effect sizes, it turns out, are not that different, or if we at least begin to understand the determinants of effect size, then I think we may well say, well, is our focus on confirming this narrow scientific hypothesis about mechanism of action, is that our priority? Or is our priority helping decision makers choose which of these alternative interventions need to be favored in their decision-making situation? I think that as we get a better handle on what determines effect size, and I think we'll get that by meta-regressions from Précis analyses of large bodies of randomized trials, as we get a better handle on that, I think we may have a better sense of which of these two approaches is the best one to do first. But I don't think that we can be confident of arguing the first, which one is best first from theory.
Thanks very much. Lindsay, so Nellie Oakey asks a very direct question. So how does learning health system thinking differ from integrated knowledge translation and implementation science? Are they really just the same thing, or are they actually embedded in learning health systems?
So it's a very astute question, and if you do a search for integrated knowledge translation related to learning health systems, you will find that those two terms are actually very often conflated. The way that I view it is that integrated knowledge translation to me is something that sits in those individual cycles of learning. So it's about that one cycle and not so much about the scale and spread. So the single cycle doesn't make a system in and of itself. So I think integrated knowledge translation is a critical component of a high functioning learning health system, but is not the only thing that's necessary. It's a core piece, but doesn't imply everything that the system itself it needs in order to function. I hope that addresses that.
Great, thanks very much. So Jessica Inskip has an interesting question, which is, do we have to modify our expectations of how effective new therapies are or appear to be if we are to conduct more pragmatic randomized controlled trials? and those that are more relevant within the system. I guess there's a premise in the question that we might get results that indicate that interventions are less effective if we do pragmatic clinical trials. But maybe Merrick, you could give us your thoughts on that question.
I would guess that the main determinant of the effect size you're looking at is whether there's an existing effective treatment or not. So for example, the difference between the immunogenicity of the new COVID vaccines and nothing is a pretty large difference. So every time you're working on a new problem for which there's no proven intervention, there's a very large difference that you're working towards finding. And so the trial size for those sorts of situations may not be very, very small at all. It might be a huge effect size, and therefore not a very large trial is needed. Where we struggle with effect sizes is particularly within drug group new Me Too drugs. Now, the difference, I think, between the different drugs in the generations of cholesterol-lowering agents is about 2%. And so to find such a small margin of effect, you, of course, will need a large trial. And so I think that thinking about more pragmatic trials also pushes us to find the biggest gaps in our knowledge and close them. I look forward to a situation where it's not possible to do a trial big enough to distinguish between the many therapeutic options we have for every possible situation. And just to say that in health services delivery and other things like, say, public health interventions, often there are fewer existing options that have been shown to be effective against nothing. And so I think there are actually large gaps in our knowledge, and the effect sizes that we're looking to capture may not be tiny. They might be fairly large. And why don't we focus on those big gaps where there's relatively low-hanging fruit and large yields in outcome, whether that outcome be health or efficiency or something else first? Why don't we do those first?
I think
Which is a neat way of avoiding answering the question. But the real answer to the question is we don't yet know what the difference in effect sizes is between pragmatic trials and explanatory trials, and so we can't really say what direction that's going to go.
I think we're going to end up with some ongoing discussion on that topic as the day progresses, and I look forward to that. My colleague Armine Kazanjian encourages us to, I think, reflecting on the point that you were making, Merrick, about the staged rollout of interventions within healthcare systems and the opportunities, if we would embrace that, to conduct pragmatic trials. I guess the question is, why don't we see more of that embracing of a staged rollout within health systems? And maybe I would ask both of you to reflect on that. I'll go to you, Lindsay, first, and then to you, Merrick.
Armine's question, and I really like your point, Armine, about Friedman having the Friedman diagram having a second version, and I agree. And when I first saw his diagram, the one with the multiple circles, I was like, to me, that looks like evidence-based policymaking going down the drain. So we need to rethink the way that is structured. You're totally correct that it really is those cycles that are the closest to the platform in these really tight clinical contexts where we've seen the best implementation of the learning health system model. And for a lot of reasons, it's because it's the simplest way to do it. You have data systems where the patient experience is complete and visible within that system. You don't have a patient going multiple places within multiple systems where it's difficult to track their experiences and difficult to track their outcomes. You have systems and structures of governance where you have people able to sort of dictate how things are going to be done, which is not sufficient to push that learning health system forward, but in many ways is necessary. As soon as you start to sort of move things higher level, move them away from the platform, you introduce a whole host of challenges. You introduce the fact that you have multiple competing data systems where you have patients traveling from one to another, so their experience isn't isolated within a single context. You're missing some of that governance structure. You're missing that authority to sort of say, this is the way that we're going to be building this system. This is the way that it's going how it's going to function. And I feel like the diagram that Friedman proposed doesn't capture that in just these increasing circles. The other thing that I think that diagram fails to capture is the fact that sometimes you can have systems that rely on independent platforms that need to learn from each other. And that's not captured in increasing sizes of circles. So you can have one functional learning health system operating with its own data infrastructure that wants to share and be able to implement knowledge into another system that's, you know, a separate set of circles almost. And that sort of secondary transfer isn't captured by that diagram either. I don't know if I went a little far afield from what you were starting at, but yeah, I definitely agree that perhaps that diagram needs to be sort of reconsidered, particularly when we're starting to think about how do we move away from learning health systems as a concept that is in these isolated sort of clinical contexts that are close to that platform versus ones that are higher versus ones that are separate entirely.
Eric, any thoughts on why that sort of rollout, staged rollout, isn't being embraced by health systems?
Well, I think if we look historically, randomization takes away control over who gets something first. And randomization was resisted historically by physicians for a very long time after it was invented in the 1940s for health. And it's because there's a strong belief, there was then among clinicians, that they could predict the individual outcome and the individual response to the intervention that was being tested. And that's true also among decision makers that I've worked with. And so I think it's really hard for a profession that's used to having control over the rollout of a new intervention to let go of that control to something as random as randomization. It feels irresponsible. It feels as if it's leaving it open to the winds of chance, which indeed it is. So when clinicians began to accept randomization, when they began to realize that their own interference, if you want to call it that, or their own attempts to control rollout were leading to invalid answers to the questions that they wanted answered. It's only when you realize that by interfering in the random allocation, you actually bias the outcome, the answer, that you start saying, well, maybe I shouldn't do that. And the only way to not interfere is to do it in some form of random allocation. I think that when we have a situation where an intervention is rolled out according to policymaker or decision maker choice, and it fails dramatically, but is only realized later that it's failed, that will be the beginning of our learning towards randomizing in the policy and health systems arena. Remember, I mean, the decision makers that I've worked with, really believe that they know which clinics will benefit most from the, say, quality improvement intervention that I'm suggesting they randomize.
And just as a supplement to that, I think just like and I think it's consistent with what you're saying, but there's sort of almost the desire to show like big benefit early, and like therefore selection of those sort of places where there's an expectation that big benefit is going to be shown early to sort of support the decision, I think is part of that. But it does, like, there's a presumption that you can actually predict that as a policymaker as well. I think.
So
sorry,
if I can just add one small item to that, even that isn't the full explanation. I was once involved with a decision maker who needed to evaluate an intervention for which there were around 5,000 possible units that could be randomized. So of those 5,000 units, some 500 or so volunteered to be part of the first wave. And in my discussions with the decision maker who was designing the rollout, trying to persuade them of the need for either a stepped wedge or some sort of cluster randomized trial, they said, well, I know which ones will succeed and I need some successes early. To which the response is, that's no problem. Take off your top 20 or top 50, your top 100, and let's randomize the remaining 90% or 80%. But even that wasn't acceptable.
Which I think speaks to Jean Smart as sort of pointing us to reflect on educational needs in this space. So the role of education and preparing the world for learning health systems. So maybe Lindsay, you want to speak to that.
Yeah, sure. It's an excellent question, and I think it's a complex one because it's not just learnings that have to happen in the delivery system, but also in the academic and scientific system as well. So having gone through a PhD program, we're all trained to do research within the context of academia. We're not trained as well to do research in the context of active clinical care environments, which is a really, it's a different procedure, it's a different process. You work with different stakeholders and different data. So on that end, they are starting to change a little bit the way that we train our scientists and our academics. CIHR has their Health System Impact Fellowship program now, which is all about embedding PhD students and postdoctoral fellows into health service delivery and into policy environments to sort of learn how to apply the tools and approaches that they've learned through their programs in those contexts more directly. I think there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of creating appropriate sort of 1 foot in the academy, 1 foot in clinical care delivery or policy positions, because there aren't that many of those in existence as yet. So that's the direction we need to move. There's also like large scale educational changes that need to happen more on the health service delivery side of things. So when physicians, nurses, other healthcare professionals are being trained, having a basic understanding of how these research and data collection processes work and how those feedback loops work within the context of the system to improve patient care, I think is going to be really necessary. And that training has to happen both on the sort of clinical care side, but also on the management and on the policy side. So it really is quite a culture shift that's necessary, both on the research arm, but also on the clinical care and the management and the policy arm as well. So
great. Thanks very much. We're running a little short on time, but Graham Dixon asked 2 questions, so I want to at least get to one of Graham's questions if I can. So this is for you, Merrick. Has your PRACY2 tool been adapted to help design or evaluate, I guess, other interventions such as educational programs?
The PRACY tool is neutral on what the intervention is that's being tested. So it's not designed specifically for, say, evaluation of drugs in randomized trials. And the examples we use to help illustrate those 9 domains are quite widespread. They come from all sorts of areas, not just clinical medicine, drugs, and technologies. So yes, educational interventions, it's widely used for implementation interventions, knowledge translation interventions. And in fact, we've just published an adaptation of it specifically framed in the language of implementation science. The primary author on that is
we can post that.
I'm trying to remember.
We'll post it in the chat.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Great. We should draw to a close. So it falls upon me to express my huge thanks to Lindsay and to Merrick for 2 great presentations and a very engaging discussion. Thank you for all of the questions that came from the audience as well. I think that's really kicked us off well for the day, talking about pragmatic clinical trials and learning health systems. We will try to answer all of the questions, even if we didn't get to them verbally. We'll do that through the chat. And so I will draw this to a close and look forward to engaging with everyone as the day progresses. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stan.